Happy New Year. Happy 20. When I was growing up, I was always thinking 2020 was going to be this like futuristic year. And I was talking with my kids about how it just feels kind of normal. But there's a lot of things that I think were predicted 20, 30, 40 years ago that are actually, in fact, happening today. So it's kind of cool to be here at this time. So this is indeed a work in progress. I'm going to share with you some preliminary findings that a team and I made up of Kevin, Sean, and Brian. Those of you who do not know Kevin, he's one of our T15 pre-doctoral fellows. And I want to give him a lot of credit because a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today, he has done the analysis for, the data management, a lot of the background research. But we're going to be talking about underrepresented racial minorities in the biomedical informatics field. And we're going to sort of take a different tact at looking at this that builds on some of our previous work looking at underrepresented racial minorities in the public health fields. But we're going to jump straight into it. I don't think it's going to come as a surprise with some of these introductory comments that certain racial groups that make up almost a third of the US population make up significantly smaller percentages of folks in lots of different academic disciplines, certainly in the academy, and STEM fields in particular are usually criticized for being behind in attracting underrepresented racial minorities. Some of the aggregate data that's available for all STEM fields suggests that only about 9% of people earning PhDs in 2017 were from an underrepresented minority background. And again, contrast this with the fact that they make up almost a third of the US population. As a result of so few PhD grads, there's a shortage of underrepresented minorities, and I will use the term URMs or ERMs sometimes in my talk. There is a shortage of folks in academia and in industry, which ultimately results in a lack of an important perspective in a lot of the STEM work that occurs. If you don't know, biomedical informatics is considered a STEM field, and this lack of a perspective, the underrepresentation of important perspectives ends up creating lots and lots of problems on a grand scale, particularly in biomedical informatics. And if you just look at the news or the national press of the last couple of months to see what kind of serious problems we end up having from having this underrepresented viewpoint in a lot of the academic and industry work that we do, you could see very quickly why this is something that should be of concern for everyone. And so, despite these ramifications, we know from the literature that underrepresented minorities have lots of different challenges at every step of the way. Researchers have conceptualized a pipeline where lots of things have to line up for someone to make it all the way out of a PhD program and eventually into a research career, whether in academia or industry. And it is exceptionally well documented that URMs face challenges at every stage of the pipeline. Even before this pipeline, middle school, elementary school, many of these challenges are socioeconomic in nature, but not exclusively. We know that URMs take much longer to complete PhD programs. We know that they drop out at higher rates, and all of the disadvantages that are well documented in literature typically play a big role in each of those decisions. And so lots of US policies have attempted to increase the number of STEM trainees overall, but in particular URM STEM trainees. And these policies have attempted to do so at all levels: undergrad, grad, PhD, postdoc. Many of the programs we have here relates to that. And as a result, there's lots of fellowships and other training opportunities. And while they've had some success at the individual level, it's not clearly documented that collectively these policies have made a difference in changing the production of underrepresented minority scientists and researchers in academia and in industry. And so we said, let's look at the opportunity of looking within biomedical informatics. As you know, it is a pretty diverse umbrella of fields that folks come into from lots of different ways. And we have access to some restricted data that I'll talk about in just a second that no one has ever really analyzed for this purpose. And so we got together and said, is there anything that we can do ultimately in the last bullet, which I have grayed out, I'm going to start with. Ultimately, we want to try to generate insights about how to improve the rates of underrepresented minority PhDs coming out of biomedical informatics programs. And that's part of the work in progress. And that hopefully if we have some time at the end of my talk, we can brainstorm a little bit about that, because I think the team would benefit from some talking points given the data that I'm going to present. But the data I'm going to present are really made up of the two first bullet points. Can we look at the trends over time of PhD grads from biomedical informatics programs and see, has it changed? How are we doing compared to other STEM fields? And ultimately, since I think maybe somewhat selfishly we're interested in seeing more underrepresented minorities in academia, what are the characteristics of the folks coming out of programs that are going into academic positions? And is there anything modifiable in terms of the environment of their training or how to attract them or how to retain them that we can use as information to inform the literature? So the data comes from the Survey of Earned Doctorates, and it's a US Department of Education and NSF survey that goes out to 100% of everyone earning a research doctorate in any US accredited institution. And it's done so almost immediately right before graduation. So after someone completes all of the requirements of their degree and they file with their university to graduate, the university, on behalf of the NSF and the US Department of Education, administers it. It's paper or electronic. The individual typically has the choice. And there are above 95% response rates every single year. And so this represents pretty much the complete census of everyone getting a research doctorate. Now, what is a research doctorate? The most common one is the PhD, but it also involves doctorates of science and SEDs and others. The university themselves determine whether or not a particular degree is considered a research doctorate, but it typically excludes MDs, DDSs, DMDs, other clinically oriented. And so any doctorate can make it in here. The vast majority of them are PhDs and almost no MDs or dental degrees or other clinical doctoral degrees. So one of the questions on the survey asks the respondents to indicate from a very long list, including some 300 odd individual scientific disciplines, on what is your discipline. And this is what the list generally looks like. And as I mentioned, biomedical informatics is pretty diverse. And there's very few people, there is no discrete category for biomedical informatics on the Survey of Earned Doctorates. And so the team came together to try to brainstorm how we can identify folks. Now, luckily, the survey also asks what was your primary field and select a 3-digit code that represents it. And they also say, if you had a secondary field, if your dissertation focus had a secondary field, tell us what that was. And the majority of respondents indicate a secondary field. And so how we identified folks is first and foremost, and we had 3 total categories. So to get into our sample that we are calling biomedical informatics related, if you check the box that your degree was in bioinformatics straight up, regardless of what your secondary field was, we counted you. If you said that you had a primary computer science related field, and I'll show you a list of all those in just a second, and you had a secondary health related field, I'll show you those also, we counted you in the second category. And then the reverse, if you were primarily in a health program with a secondary computer science focus, we also counted you. And so to get, these are the computer science fields for those of you interested, and these are the health fields. and we were very inclusive with these definitions. And so again, these three categorizations together we called biomedical informatics related. Underrepresented minorities are defined many different ways by many different organizations. We went with the National Science Foundation's definition, which includes Blacks or African Americans, Hispanic Americans, American Indians, Native Alaskans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. In some cases, Asians are considered minorities, but not necessarily underrepresented minorities by this definition. And so that'll be important to keep in the back of your mind as we look at some of the data. We grouped these into three categories, mainly because of the small sample sizes in some of them. And so we have three main categories of URMs, Black African American, which I will refer to here as Black, Hispanic Americans, which includes lots of different individual countries of origin, and then a catch-all category for other URMs, which also includes anyone who indicated they were biracial in one of these categories as one of the races. So we're going to look at data over a 16-year period. It started off as a 15-year period, but then more data came out, so we immediately added it because we weren't fully done yet. We're going to look at some descriptive statistics and some graphs. We're going to see who's going into academic positions and what kind of proportions. And we're going to sort of throw this into a couple of regressions to see what kind of individual person and university characteristics are associated with being an URM graduate and being an URM graduate that goes into an academic position. Sample included little bit over 2,400 people getting a PhD, research doctorate during this time period. Majority were male. The most common age category was 31 to 40. You could see the distribution of race, where we're going to start getting into the underrepresented minorities, which are each in single digits and collectively added together over the entire time period at around 11.9%. I think it was 12%. Carnegie classification talks about the research intensivity of the university. If you don't know, R1s are considered research intensive, and it's not surprising the vast majority of PhD grads come from there, because one of the criteria to be an R1, which IU is having a certain number of PhD programs which count towards your research intensivity. That doesn't mean people cannot get PhDs from other institutions. Almost everyone had no dependent children at the time of graduation. The majority came from public universities. And here's the breakdown from those three categories that I described to you. The vast majority of people in our, well, I shouldn't say vast, but the majority of people in our sample come from that discrete category of bioinformatics, straight up primary discipline. When you look at the number of grads over time, you could see this kind of steady increase in all of these three programs together, or these three categories together. We're now graduating somewhere in the neighborhood of about 300 to 400 PhD grads in biomedical related programs nationally annually. And you can see this significant increase during the last decade or so. That frankly, I think lots of people have intuited, but hasn't been documented in this way. When we look at this is the N, so this is the number of grads per year by race. And you could see sort of the massive increase over time has really been driven by both an increase in Asian and whites, to a much lesser degree, a slight uptick in some of the underrepresented racial minorities in more recent years. And so when I take the same data and we display it as in each year, what proportion was in each race, you could see that whites who were dominating have sort of been matched or at least caught up with Asians, but by and large, all three of the underrepresented minority categories have kind of hovered each below 10%, sometimes, extremely low in the 1 or 2% range in a given year. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those bottom three lines and add them all together and just show you them over time with the actual ends there also. And what you could see, the gray line is the median there, or the average across each year. It's hovering in that 12% range for all underrepresented minorities, and that doesn't appear to have really changed by much. Importantly, when you look at the sample sizes, there are some years where the United States is graduating 2 or 3 or 4 total underrepresented minorities in a pretty broad and diverse field. And that's part of the problem that I think everyone has intuited, but really has never seen in, for lack of a better term, black and white like this. When you look at, tough crowd. When you look at these doctoral recipients by race and each of those 3 categories that I talked about, bioinformatics straight up, computer science as your primary field, or health as your primary field, some interesting things jump out. First and foremost, whereas Hispanics make up 5.7% of everyone, they appear to be congregating more in the computer science and health primary fields as opposed to the straight up bioinformatics. Blacks, on the other hand, even though they make up just over 3% of all grads, there's more than double that in the health column. When you look at Asians, whereas they make up 40% overall, they are a little bit more concentrated in the straight up bioinformatics category. And when you look at, so I'll just let you take that in for a second. And these differences that I highlighted in yellow were statistically significant in these bivariate analyses. So it turns out the survey also asks at the time of graduation, and I think that's important because you're about to literally get your degree. It's not the end-all, be-all indicator of your employment or your employability, but it asks the question, what is the status of your post-grad plans? Category 1 and 2, we are considering as employment. I'm going back to where I was working before, or I have signed a commitment to work somewhere, including a postdoc. The other categories, 3 to 7, we are currently categorizing as not yet with a job at that time. And it also asks if you said yes to 1 or 2. In B3, B6 question says, what type of organization is the employer? And you can see categories 1 through 6, we will be calling educational categories to sort of get a measure of academia, but everything else is going to be considered a 0 in our analysis. So when we look at who got academic positions, overall, you could see in the total down here, about 82% of folks coming out with a PhD across the entire time frame. 82% say they have a job in academia ready to go at the time of the survey. When you look at bioinformatics as a primary field, you'll see that not really statistically meaningful differences across race categories. Somewhere between 80 and 90% of folks end up taking jobs in academia. When you look at computer science as a primary field, somewhere in the mid-80s% with some fluctuations that are not statistically significant, probably because of sample sizes, particularly in that last column where very few people identify. In the health field, and recall that the health field was one of the disciplines that were disproportionately graduating Blacks and African Americans. Over here, particularly Blacks were significantly or marginally significantly less likely in bivariate analysis to be going into academic positions. And when you look sort of at the total, Hispanics go into academic positions at significantly higher rates than all the other races in these bivariate analyses. So when we put this all into the regression, and I know that's really small, so I'll just give you the takeaways. Being an underrepresented minority was associated with being single and never married, but also with having at least one dependent. Being a US citizen, and interestingly, at least in our data, being Asian was associated with not being a US citizen, whereas being an underrepresented minority was associated with being a citizen. Computer science and health primary fields, being an underrepresented minority suggests you're more likely to come from those two categories as opposed to the straight up bioinformatics category. And we ran it all sorts of different ways to see if the increase over time mattered, but you saw that trend with the line. We looked at it categorically, year bands, the linear time trend. There's no significant changes over time in the proportion of underrepresented minorities overall. So when we did the same model, predicting what are the characteristics associated with being an ERM that goes into an academic position, generally similar things. They're not in the oldest category. They still have those one or two dependents. They're a US citizen. Academically, they are less likely. That's actually a typo. It should be a negative, not a positive. Academics, underrepresented minorities going into the academic positions were less likely to have come from a health field. I think I'm recalling that correctly. They were less likely to be from a private school. And again, this trend has not changed over time during the 16-year period. So takeaways, 12% are underrepresented minorities. That hasn't changed much. Individual categories, and by the way, I know that I speak for the team when I say lumping all of these very diverse subgroups of people into even one category of underrepresented minorities is a disservice, in part because all of their experiences are different. But I think it's an important kind of first brush way of characterizing the situation and getting the conversation going. Each of the individual categories are usually single digits and sometimes minuscule. The sample sizes are so small. And I think there's maybe some insight to be had about this single with dependence that seems related to being an underrepresented minority, which comes with lots of different life challenges, which I think, at least in academia, we have the potential to affect, in part because schedules tend to be a little bit more flexible in the kinds of things that we do, at least on the research side of academia. A couple of quick limitations, just to mention, we only include 3 categories of graduates. It's conceivable that there's lots of other folks in the biomedical informatics field, particularly those with clinical degrees, that our data just does not capture. We did the best we can with what we had. You get jobs very soon after graduation that would not be captured in our data. The most recent data isn't available yet. It usually lags, and we, as I mentioned before, have access to the restricted data, which also lags, but it gets aggregated, and none of the individual information that allows this kind of analysis is part of the public file. The public file really is just super high-level information by STEM field or by social science that doesn't allow you to track individuals. And there's actually longitudinal data. Each year, the survey of earned doctorates has a companion survey that randomly selects people from the universe in previous years and surveys them with what's going on in your career. And we have access to that also. And so we haven't yet began analyzing it, but are planning to do more things just to see how the professional experience of different types of individuals unfold as their career starts. So I'll take any questions, but also let me put out there a question. And this is more for discussion. And so if we have 5 minutes, I'd love to use it. What can we do here in the Center for Biomedical Informatics and all the academic departments on campus that support recruitment to the Regenstrief Institute to increase representation from as many different racial and ethnic backgrounds as is possible, in part because our work that comes out here requires this diverse set of perspectives. Otherwise, we will be putting more things out into the world that will potentially do harm and not live up to the good that we'd like it to. So.
Nir?
Titus.
You knew I would have an opinion on that. Let me answer you a question first, or give some information on that. So clearly, building a pipeline of URMs in biomedical informatics is a high priority for all the reasons that you described. Around the country, there have been certain places that have invested in kind of what's invariably called the high school scholars program. So you see it at AMIA. It's now a formal part of the program at AMIA, where high school students present. And some of those presentations are excellent. I know some around the room have listened to them, might even be on the selection, in the selection process. A lot of energy for these programs comes out of places like Vanderbilt, Pitt, who have formal high school scholars training programs within their training programs. So I'm most familiar with the one at Pitt. So Mike Bisich, he actually raised private money to support that, to endow the program. And they have a formal program where there's, usually between 5 and 8 people in that. I think that's obviously the long view. That's like getting somebody from high school on the way to a PhD. You're talking about a long trajectory, and you reference some of the educational limitations that people coming from URMs have to get into PhD programs. But for me, that's like one hopeful sign of addressing the situation that you describe.
Thank you.
I'm also going to have an opinion on
Sure. And I saw Peter kind of jumped up first with his hand.
I was actually going to say that I've been talking to Peter about that. and the idea, and I was actually going to present in the town hall on Friday. One of my goals is to really work on that space for our research component and discuss with our future research council on how we do this, and bringing together all our academic programs to have a discussion about that. We see that there may be chances of engaging the public health systems here in Indianapolis, at least to start with, and maybe get some funding to start a program such like that. Also had some conversation with Sarah Weehee to CTSI is trying to do something similar to get that connection to CTSI to maybe partner together in this endeavor. So we are working on that, and I'm so glad to see that, because that gives me some, real numbers to be able to present.
And let me open up the opportunity to use our data with us for anything that would be beneficial. It sits on an enclave in Chicago, and we have access to it, but we haven't even scratched the surface. There's dozen more data elements that we just haven't got a chance to get to.
Yeah, so you'll be hearing from me to maybe join this.
That'd be awesome.
And I agree with everything that's been said. I would just add, I think this is very, very important work, because I think it does exactly what you said. It shines a light on this issue, and it allows us to sort of point to it as a concern. So in addition to the local activities, I think we can certainly use this to accelerate and should. We also, I think, can use this by communicating with our colleagues, for instance, at the NIH and at the National Library of Medicine in particular, so that those of us with training programs can perhaps even suggest and advocate for special supplements that would be dedicated to the, even at the level of bringing in fellows and others, additional resources. But I agree with what's been said, and I think we've recognized in AMIA for quite some time, we've got to move the pipeline up as much as possible to really just even introduce the field to people earlier in their lives, so that they even know that this is a career trajectory they can pursue, and then create opportunities for them to continue to pursue this line of study.
So my last comment will be, and I know I'm out of time, so I apologize, but I'll hang out if anyone wants to chat afterwards. The business disciplines have created something called the PhD project that has been wildly successful in increasing and retaining underrepresented minorities in PhD programs and then in academic positions. If you knew anyone who had sort of influence at AMIA, and this was something that we can house here with some more national or international punch, I think it would really put us on the map as doing important work that would benefit us and folks in Indiana and elsewhere. So, thank you.